Latter-day Contemplation is a podcast hosted by two Latter-day Saints who have found great value in experiencing God through walking a path of contemplation. The views expressed herein are our own.
Hello and welcome to Latter-day Contemplation. We're your hosts, Christopher Hurtado
And Riley Risto.
Latter-day Contemplation started as an exploration of contemplative practices from many traditions to enhance our discipleship of Jesus Christ. We're by no means experts in the topics we discuss, but what we have is an openness to questions, a hunger to discover truth wherever we can find it, and a desire to share in the transformative life of inner peace. We love that you've joined us, and we hope that you find value in this community.
Welcome back to Latter-day Contemplation. I'm Riley Risto.
And I'm Christopher Hurtado.
We've been away a little while, and we're glad to be back at it. Today we're going to be discussing a couple Stoic concepts, consent to destiny and objectivity, what's been called Amor Fati. I guess that was coined by Friedrich Nietzsche, but nevertheless, it's a kind of an adopted Stoic term, right?
Yeah.
And so we're going to incorporate
love of fate,
love of what is.
Loving what is, as Byron Katie would put it.
Yeah. So,
although she's coming from a Buddhist perspective, it's very similar.
I mean, you're in this frame of existence right now where you just kind of have to love what is, right, Chris?
I have no other alternative. I don't get to change it.
Yeah, you've been dealing with some ongoing kind of chronic back pain, and not a lot you can do about it, although you've tried. You've done some physical therapy and chiropractic and medication, but it's just still hanging around.
You make a really good point. There is a lot I can do, but that I don't get to decide whether it works. I get to decide what I do. I do the things. I move, I walk, I bicycle, I swim, I rest. I can do all those things. I go to the chiropractor. I've had this, that, and the other injections. I don't get to decide whether I get well. I only get to decide what I do, and that's very much a Stoic concept.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, there is a whole set of people who are of the mindset that, your mind heals your body and you can decide to be healthy and all that stuff. I mean, I think it's pretty clear you would like to be, right?
Absolutely. Well, again, you can choose your course of action. You just can't choose the result, right? So maybe me making that choice, and I am making that choice, and I make daily affirmations that to back that up. But I still don't get to decide whether that actually works or in what timetable it actually works. Yeah. I do trust it's working. Everything that I've done is healing me. But no one thing has healed me yet, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and ultimately there may be larger purpose to this stuff. I mean, one of the things that we do as humans is we try to make meaning out of our circumstances, no matter whether they're good or bad. And so this is a period of your life where you can look back on it at some point, hopefully, removed from the situation, God willing, and be able to say, exactly, and be able to say that this was a learning experience.
Yes. God willing.
Okay. Well, so that's it. We're going to talk about that. Whatever circumstances are besetting you in your life at this time, hopefully this episode will give you a tool or two to be able to approach those with the right frame of mind, the right mindset. And so maybe we start with this consent to destiny. Kind of a technical Stoic term. What does that mean, Chris?
Yeah, so you have... It relates very closely to another concept that we very much want to talk about, which is objectivity. So first, life is coming at you, however it's coming at you. And you don't actually, again, get to decide how life comes at you. But you do get to decide, and this is where I know that there's a growing, what can I say, Riley? How should I put it?
Movement?
There's a growing movement or agreement about the idea that there is no free will, right? That it's some kind of persistent illusion. You have new atheists like Sam Harris pushing this agenda. Viktor Frankl, in his landmark book, Man's Search for Meaning, describes his experience as it's Auschwitz, right? He's a death camp survivor, whichever death camp it was, Nazi death camp survivor. And he tells of his experience of, and I remember Stephen Covey mentioned this too in his book, probably after Frankl in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that there's this space between stimulus and response, and it is in that space that you act freely. So I can't decide what's coming at me, but I can decide how I respond. And the Stoic idea is not to respond emotionally, but to respond objectively. So you sort of freeze frame, you look at what's coming at you, turn it around, look at all sides, and make some kind of objective, rational, objective determination about it. And the Stoics believe this is possible because for them, there's a reason in nature that the reason that is part of that reason in nature that is in you can actually find a way to understand the reason in nature because they're related. It's the same principle, this rational principle, what's called the logos, which by the way was a name that was used for a term that was used for Christ, right, in the New Testament, this rational principle.
So the scientific materialist folks, the determinist, will have us believe that as soon as the universe, the Big Bang happened or whatever happened, this moment zero, as soon as that happened, that a set of circumstances were set into motion because there's a certain amount of energy put into a certain amount of mass and material, and it just has to play out a certain way. I mean, they've got mathematical proofs for all this stuff. And I mean, even from a mathematical standpoint, you look at quantum mechanics, for instance, and there's this observer effect. I'm not sure if that's what it's actually called, but essentially if you take some electrons and you shoot them at a screen and you've got, some blocking mechanism in front of it, the electrons will line up in an array behind that screen, and you can actually see it after the fact, and there will be 1, 2, or 3 different arrays that the electron splits into as a result of being blocked by these 2 impediments. But when you put a camera on it and it's observed, then the electrons act differently. And I'm not sure if that's a great way to explain it. I'm sure there's mathematicians out there that can do it, but the point of it is that the observer, in this case just the video camera watching it happen, changes the motion of the electrons. And so if we put ourselves into that sort of relationship or allegory, and we say, well, we're the observer, we're the ones that are watching life unfold, and just the fact that we're there and seeing things happen means the universe acts just a little bit differently.
And it's not hard to understand that from a personal standpoint, because there's whatever happens. Let's say there's an accident and there are bystanders and they witness the accident. We know that if we ask them what happened, that even though one thing happened, you'll get as many different stories about what happened as there are observers, witnesses of the accident. And so that's I think a concrete example of how that works. Yeah.
And there's the telephone game. That's the same sort of idea, right? The more a message is transmitted from one to another, the more the story changes. And that's the story of history. Same thing. So this consent to destiny, it sounds like destiny is this, unmovable, rolling giant stone down a hill that no one can get in the way of. It just is what it is. But all around this stone rolling down the hill, there are reactions. So it's the response that you're talking about, right? And how we react to that stone coming down the hill is within our control. The stone itself, we have no control over. That thing's going to roll.
But to further your analogy, Riley, we could choose to throw another stone, a smaller stone, in the path of the larger stone and divert it. Ultimately, it's going to end up somewhere, and somebody's going to have to accept that. But you can see that along the way, I have choice, and I could actually divert that path, right? That's still possible. And so that's why I act. We would never want anybody to get the impression that to be a Stoic means that you wouldn't act, because what's the point when everything is determined? The Stoics do believe that everything is determined, but we don't have to worry about that. As a matter of fact, those kind of questions weren't even dealt with by the most famous Stoics that everybody knows. People know Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus. Musonius Rufus is a lesser known Roman Stoic, but most people have never heard of the Greek Stoics, and a lot of their writings don't even come down to us. They were writing about physics. Their idea of how we should behave, how we should live, how we should act comes from the way they think that reality works. We can disagree with with their conception of how reality works, and yet we can still choose to act in this way for our own reasons, because we do think that ultimately what ends up being the case isn't entirely up to us. And by the way, that's because everybody else has free will too. That's one reason why. That's one explanation for it. That's why we can't ultimately decide what happens. But whatever happens, we have to be willing to accept it. That's the idea of consent to destiny, or Amor Fati, as you put it, from Nietzsche, love of fate. This is my fate, and I love it.
I mean, so we've got Nietzsche expressing this idea in the 19th century, but this concept is really old. And you mentioned the ancient Greeks, but this exists in Christianity as well. You have this moment in the Garden of Gethsemane where Christ says to his Father, "If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." It's almost like there's space that he's allowing or recognizing for action to take place, and yet at the same time acknowledging that if there are circumstances beyond his control, he's willing to, just live with that.
Yeah, let this cup pass. Nevertheless, I consent to destiny.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's interesting because the Stoic ideas and the Christian ideas do actually match up a lot, and it turns out that the predominant philosophy at the time of Christ was Stoicism. The Roman religion, as we would call it today, was the philosophy of Stoicism. So there's a little bit of an ambiguation there, right? Let me disambiguate. The philosopher Pierre Hadot, who wrote the Philosophy as a Way of Life, the book Philosophy as a Way of Life, which I recommend at least reading the title essay, Philosophy as a Way of Life, is an essay within the book that takes the title from the essay. You can download a PDF free. I've found it just by Googling it. He points out that in antiquity, philosophy was a way of life. Today, philosophy is about, ivory tower cogitations and far removed from the practical everyday life, whereas you have people like Ryan Holiday, New York Times bestseller, writing books about Stoicism, calling himself a philosopher when he has no training to be a philosopher. This idea of training to be a philosopher to train other philosophers to be philosophers comes from the Middle Ages. In antiquity, philosophy was about my relationship with ultimate reality. That's another way of saying God, if you believe in God. And if you don't believe in God, then there's some other ultimate reality. But the point is, behind all of it, there's something. And so ultimate reality, I have to deal with, and the way that I deal with it nowadays, we call that religion. In antiquity, it was called philosophy. For them, what they called religion, for us looks more like support the troops. USA, USA, support the troops. Right or wrong, by the way, it's about the relationship of man to the state, whereas philosophy is about the relationship of man with ultimate reality. So that's more like our religion today. And these two philosophies or religions, if they are coexisting at the same time, I don't know whether one was influenced by the other, but I do know that Seneca and Jesus are born around the same time, sometime between 6 and 4 BCE, and that they're both Stoics, even though one calls himself a Stoic and the other calls himself a Christian. Just kidding, he doesn't call himself a Christian, but you know what I mean.
Well, I like that you bring up that, philosophy in antiquity was really a practice. It was a way of life, and it wasn't a way of thinking. It was a way of doing. And we still have those people today. You mentioned Ryan Holiday, but Byron Katie's another one that we've had some particular interest in lately, and reading her stuff. And you've incorporated some of that into the Come Follow Me podcast with Ben Peterson. But Byron Katie puts out this article, and she has this, what she calls the way, right? Is it the way, or is it
the work?
The work. That's right. Sorry, it's the work. Yeah.
And she is a Buddhist, but Buddhism and Stoicism are a lot alike. And I don't know, we know that Socrates, one of the ingredients in Stoicism is Socrates. Another ingredient is Heraclitus. And I mentioned Heraclitus in the Proverbs podcast on our Come Follow Me podcast. So we don't know if there's an influence from Buddhism to Stoicism or the other way around, but I can give you a parallel example. We only recently found that there's some kind of connection between ancient skepticism, Pyrrhonic skepticism, and Hinduism. There's some kind of relationship there. And Buddhism comes out of Hinduism. There's a lot of contact, based on commerce across that part of the, those parts of the world. We think Socrates traveled to India, but we don't know all these details. But the fact is, her concept is very much like the Stoic concept. Loving what is. That means embracing destiny, right? Amor Fati.
Well, and also as a practice too, incorporating objectivity with action, it's evaluating the circumstances that come before you and asking yourself questions about those, and then, reacting as after having evaluated the fundamental nature of the circumstances confronting you. So the first question she asks is it true? This thing's coming at you.
Here comes something at me, right? Yeah.
But is it true?
One of my favorite examples from her book, Loving What Is, Riley, and I recommend listeners listen to the book because it turns out it's actually a live dialogue, that if you buy the book, you're just getting a transcription, whereas if you buy the audiobook, you're actually getting the dialogue. And this woman says her kids are throwing their clothes on the floor, and there's usually some kind of judgment at the beginning of this whole process, which is, my kids shouldn't, it's implied even if I don't say it, they shouldn't throw their clothes on the floor. And Byron Katie shows up in this tender, she's just so sweet. She just says, sweetheart, pause. That's what kids do. That's what they do.
Yeah, so it's that key word, shouldn't, right?
Yeah. You say they shouldn't throw their clothes on the floor. Well, Riley brings up the first question. Is it true? And of course she says yes. Yeah, it's true. They shouldn't. They shouldn't throw their clothes on the floor. What's the next question, Riley?
The next question is, can you absolutely know that it is true?
Now, sometimes if someone's stubborn, you have to ask this question more than once. And this may be you, by the way. You might have to ask yourself this question more than once. Yes, I absolutely know it's true. Well, okay. At some point, we have to realize if you have any kind of epistemological humility, you realize you can't know that that's true. By the way, evidence is to the contrary because they're doing it. So if I admit, okay, no, I can't absolutely know it's true. Now what?
Well, now you have to make a decision. How do you react? What happens when you believe the thought?
So this question is about, if I believe what I'm saying, they shouldn't throw the clothes on the floor, then how do I react? It makes me upset. It just bugs me that they're doing it. And see, the point we're getting at here is, if you didn't say they shouldn't throw their clothes on the floor, then you wouldn't be bugged. And this brings up a really important point about Stoicism, the point of Stoicism. We haven't mentioned that, Riley. The point of Stoicism is what they would call ataraxia, which is just a Greek term that translates undisturbedness. My goal as a Stoic is to be undisturbed, right? And this is what we think of in today's dictionary definition of Stoicism. We see someone who is just unmoved by the events, whether someone dies or whether something happens. They're just calm, cool, and collected.
Yeah, I love that.
And I don't feel calm, cool, and collected when I believe my kids shouldn't throw their clothes on the floor, and they do, because I have this unmet expectation. And so the idea is to manage your expectations, since you can't manage other people's actions.
Well, and it helps us to place properly, let's call it the blame for our emotions where they belong. And that's back at the belief that something should or should not happen. It's the belief that causes the negative emotion. It's not the action of the child that leaves his clothes on the floor. It's the belief that the child shouldn't leave his clothes on the floor, and he's doing it anyway, that causes this negative emotion in us. And so if we change our mindset about what should or shouldn't happen, and especially if we do it based on evidence, as you said, evidence to the contrary, kids leave their clothes on the floor all around the world.
Yeah, exactly. And so if I'm willing to admit that how I react when I believe kids shouldn't throw their clothes on the floor and they do, then what's your next question? This is according to Katie Byron's The Work, right?
Yeah. Who or what would you be without the thought?
And that's what you've been getting at all along, Riley, right?
Yeah. Yeah, once you've identified that it's the thought that creates the negative emotion, you then have a choice there too. It's like, can I just change my thinking and change my mood?
Yeah. Hey, by the way, Riley, I didn't mention this. I think you know this, but for the listener, Byron Katie is Stephen Mitchell's wife. Yeah. This is the Stephen Mitchell,
power couple.
the poet translator. I love. They really are. Oh man. By the way, let's go into Byron's Katie's story a little bit, because it turns out she suffered tremendously for a decade with deep depression. I mean, she was one of these people with the blinds drawn and couldn't get out of bed and food and tissues everywhere. I mean, you can just picture the scene. And she suffered, and she put an end to her own suffering through what she calls the work. And you just did it. There's actually one more step, Riley, the turnaround. The final step is the turnaround.
I'll just read this section.
Yeah.
It says, a statement can be turned around to the self, to the other, and to the opposite. For example, and she uses this Paul that she was using as an example before. Paul should understand me turns around to I should understand me. I should understand
I should throw
Paul.
the kids' clothes on the floor? That's a turnaround.
It is a turnaround. Yeah, it is.
I should throw the kids' clothes on the floor.
Yeah.
Well, look, imagine my kids still do this. Okay, I've got teens. They're actually washing the clothes. They're taking the freshly washed clothes and throwing them on the floor in a pile where they will then deal with them, okay? So I've told them all their lives, don't throw clean clothes on the floor. You just wash them. You shouldn't. They say you should on people. I have to admit, I did do that to my kids a lot. I told them you shouldn't throw your clothes on the floor. They're clean and the floor is not clean. What if I just said, well, I guess, if that's how they're going to put them away, they got to go on the floor first. Why don't I just walk in there, if I'm the one taking them out of the dryer, and just dump them in a pile on the floor? Then they'll know what to do next. That's what they're going to do anyway. They're going to throw them on the floor, and then they're going to sort them and put them away from there. So I should throw the kids' clothes on the floor. What about, so that's to the self. What about to the other?
Paul shouldn't understand me. Or
Paul shouldn't
in
understand.
This case, yeah. So
the kids should
instead
throw
of
their clothes on the floor.
Well, you shouldn't expect the kids to understand you.
Well,
this isn't
about it. This isn't about understanding Paul. This is about the kids throwing the clothes on the floor. So the turnaround for the kids throwing the clothes on the floor, the first one is I should throw the kids on the floor, kids' clothes on the floor. The second one is the kids should throw the kids' clothes on the floor. And finally, I don't know, the examples are different. Paul shouldn't understand me is different from the kids shouldn't put the clothes where they belong. You find different ways because you realize your interpretation is not reality. That's the point of the exercise, right? The point of the exercise is there's reality and there's your interpretation of reality. And going back to the Stoics, I can't decide who's my favorite Stoic, Riley. Sometimes I say Musonius Rufus because I do think he's really cool and nobody knows him. So I can stand out, right? I can be different. I don't pick Marcus Aurelius or Seneca, but I love all the Stoics. But, the Enchiridion, the manual of Epictetus, begins by making a distinction between there are some things you have control over, some things you don't. And then it mentions within your control are things, basically what you do, the things that you do. And without your control, not within your control, it's everything else. It actually says everything else. And so then it tells you should focus on the former, not the latter, meaning focus on the things that are in your control and stop trying to control things that are really beyond your control. The Alcoholics Anonymous prayer comes from this concept, very much a Stoic concept. Help me to accept the things, that I can't change and to change the things that I can change. That's a paraphrase.
Yeah, so, if we go back to the kids throwing their stuff on the floor, the real question to ask, the turnaround in this case is, kids should throw their stuff on the floor. And then it's a matter of just making a decision for yourself. And there's a couple ways to approach it. You can try to influence the circumstances that influence kids to throw their clothes on the floor. So you can offer incentives or disincentives for them to do so. Or it can just change your mind completely, and you accept the fact that kids do this and you clean it up happily as a matter of service. So it's just a way to kind of change your mindset about how circumstances cause various moods or feelings within you for good or evil.
One of the things I learned from observing one of my mentors, so it's not something that he said or, explicitly taught me. Sometimes our teachers teach us by their actions they're just doing what they do, right? Without even intending to teach. And I also noticed it just by observing myself. And that is that if you're the one who cares about the mess, you're the one who's going to have to clean it up. Because the reality is the other people aren't saying there shouldn't be a mess here. So why would they think they need to do anything to clean it up, right? If you're the one who thinks things shouldn't be the case, then do something about it. I remember I would complain, my students, when I taught philosophy at Utah Valley University, students were supposed to know how to write before they came to me. Of course, look at what I just did. They're supposed to, right? They should know how to write. They were required to take a writing class. I thought they should know how to write, if they took the writing class. This was, again, my expectation is unrealistic because that's just not how things are. I have to accept the way things are. But I did at one point, instead of complaining, I decided that I would become a part of the solution instead of just complaining about the problem. And I said, sign me up to teach English. And I started teaching English at Salt Lake Community College to teach students how to write. That's one thing I could do. I had no control over whether or not they could write. I could keep them from my class if they hadn't taken the class. But what if they took the class and they still couldn't write? That was very typical. Nothing I could do about it, except to either take some of my class time away from philosophy to teach writing, or to go teach writing to the students who haven't gone to philosophy yet.
Well, and this points, directly to D&C 120 that talks about the difference between coercion and persuasion. We can have certain beliefs about what people should or shouldn't do, and inflict punishments based on the beliefs that we have about those various actions. Or we can try to make the world just slightly better by persuading people to want to do those things that we want them to do. So that's using positive influence. That's using patient instruction and being a part of the solution rather than just complaining about the circumstances.
Yeah, complaining about the circumstances is not Stoic. And it's very much another LDS concept that comes to my mind is this idea of kicking against the pricks. If you're complaining about reality, which is as it is, because it is that it is, and it will be what it will be. And that's exactly what the ultimate reality we believe in. That's the God of Israel, right? Who says, I am that I am. I will be what I will be. And that's just ultimate reality. That's the case. That's the answer to Job. God's answer to Job is, I am that I am. I just do what I do. I be what I be. And whatever ideas you had about what should be or shouldn't be have nothing to do with me. That's you trying to impose that things should be or shouldn't be a certain way. His idea of justice, Job's idea of justice that he's trying to impose on God. Riley, I think we should have a conversation about justice sometime. Justice is another Stoic concept, but I want to expand the conversation about justice into something more than just what the Stoics thought about justice. So we'll have to revisit that.
No, I can't wait to do that. I think that's one that'll be coming up pretty quick.
Yeah, but just to mention the Stoic concept of justice, it is really that you treat others in a way that recognizes, this is very much, again, akin to Christianity. Christianity and Stoicism are very much alike in different ways, in many different ways. There are at least two books that I know of, book-length treatments of Stoicism and Christianity and their similarities. And so the idea is, I recognize that rational principle that is in me is also in you. And so therefore I treat you as I would be treated. I treat you with the respect and the dignity that you deserve as a fellow human being who embodies that same rational principle that is at the head of the universe and that is in you and in me. That imago Dei, the Christians would call it, right? that image of God that is within you. So that's the point of, where Stoic justice comes from, is that realization. And so it's very much becomes do unto others as you would have done unto you. Another Stoic concept that I'll just mention here as an aside is very much something that Jesus teaches, is this idea that your polis, or your city or community, is the whole cosmos, cosmopolitanism. So before Jesus, if you think of the ancient Israelites, Yahweh is their tribal God. And so it's very much a nationalistic narrative that you get through most of the Bible. All of, the Pentateuch, and even the early prophets, right? The Deuteronomistic historians, everything from Genesis through 2nd Chronicles in the Christian Bible. But then you get these international writings in the wisdom writings, and then Jesus gives us more of this international character, idea, feeling, which is just that we're all brothers. This isn't just for Jews. This message, this good news, this gospel of Jesus Christ is for the whole world. It's for all humans. Very much a Stoic concept, this cosmopolitanism. Marcus Aurelius, while he did as emperor, philosopher, he's their philosopher king, right? Plato's ideal. He does fight on the northern borders of the empire against the Germanic tribes as, Roman emperor. But he knows, and he writes while he's fighting these battles. This is when he writes his Meditations, the famous writings which are to himself, the original title, ton he auton, to himself, not really a book, but now it's a book. You're reading the emperor's diary, his personal diary, his journal. And he writes, as Antoninus, I'm a Roman. But as a philosopher, he realizes he's a citizen of the world.
Well, I love that. I mean, when you think about Christ, it's very much the same model. He knows who he is. And yet he recognizes that all around him are people who don't know who they are. And so rather than try to command them into obedience, he puts forth this example. And it's ironic that the way that Marcus Aurelius does it is to lead them into battle, but you can take that, again, as a metaphor for life. You show the example. You're leading your disciples into the battle of life. It can just be an extended metaphor. And so Christ, rather than just preaching obedience, an obedience model of improvement, and by the way, I think I said it was D&C 120, but it's 121 where it talks about, coercion and persuasion and which of those is the better of the two. Rather than setting up this obedience model that's based on, coercive penalties, and again, there's this conflation of justice with punishment, when justice is really about healing. And so a model of justice that is based on obedience or disobedience and punishment or blessing is one that there's no evidence for in this world. Let's just be honest. All around us, when people are obedient, you don't always see a positive outcome in their life. All around us, when people are disobedient, you don't always see them being punished. And so it just doesn't play out in reality.
So if you're Job, you say, God, you shouldn't punish me.
Right?
I didn't do anything wrong, right?
Yeah.
So
this is a microcosm. He's a metaphorical example of this philosophy playing out that so many people have, is that why am I being punished if I'm doing the right things? Job's a perfect man, and yet the worst things possible are happening to him. Boils all over his body, losing his family and his wealth. Everything bad is happening to Job, even though he's a perfect man. It's a perfect metaphor for Christ, because he also is this archetypal perfect man, and yet everything bad is happening to him. Everything bad that's possible, he suffers in this, extended metaphor of life. And so he's pointing the way not through an obedience model, which doesn't play out. I mean, this is what's being illustrated by Christ, by Job. It doesn't play out that obedience necessarily leads to blessings, right? And so instead, he's pointing us to a model of experience. You confront circumstances as they are, and you react to them in the best way possible. through acceptance.
He's really showing us the concept of Stoic consent to destiny.
Yeah, it's acceptance.
Accepting, surrendering to the will of the divine, of ultimate reality, whatever your concept of it is, whether you're Stoic or Christian, that concept differs. But either way, you have this ultimate reality that you submit to. Mm-hmm. And you do this out of a sense of, of duty in Stoicism, and a different concept in Christianity would be out of love, right? But it is very much, but you see people doing Christianity, I was going to say, submitting to God out of fear, out of obedience, but it just shows you, I think it shows an error in the concept of who and what God is, which is fundamental. Joseph Smith taught us that understanding the true nature of God was fundamental to all of life, really.
I think the main question to ask here is, would we have Christ without his suffering? Would we have, the Dalai Lama without the invasion of Tibet? Would we have Byron Katie without her depression? These people don't emerge out of a vacuum, preformed as these gurus. It doesn't work that way. So this idea of consent to destiny is what creates exceptional humans. It's how we react to the circumstances that confront us that determines who we become. And so our potential is really bound up in our trials.
Powerfully put, Riley. If our social media manager is listening, let's somebody quote Riley and stick it in a quote image.
And then edit that part out where he just said that.
Okay.
But really, it comes down to when you've accepted your circumstances and you've decided that you're going to make the best of it, whether it's just a pure learning experience with a lot of pain and suffering, or whether the experience creates in you a person who can then magnify his calling, so to speak, in this life, and be better able to exercise his vocation, then that's how we make the most of life.
This is a powerful principle. I already feel like I'm going to have a better day today just for having had this conversation with you, Riley. And we're recording in the morning, which hasn't been our modus operandi, and it's because of my back. We changed the time because of my back, and I'm reminded of the time that I taught 30 minutes every weekday, going over Marcus Aurelius's meditations. Going through that. Guiding some students through it. And I remember one particular student told me that she felt like she started her day with a shot in the arm from Marcus Aurelius, and like she had him with her. The emperor was with her, she would say, all day. Right? She felt like she had him there with him. And this is the idea, right? To hold up as Christians, Jesus as a model. Right? And she was doing that with Marcus Aurelius. A worthy model in the context in which she did. I prefer Jesus's, I think, stronger commitment to cosmopolitanism. He didn't bifurcate himself into two, right? Into I'm Antoninus on the one hand and fighting the Germanic tribes on the northern borders of the empire, pushing my Pax Romana, which is the idea of this Roman concept of peace through victory, whereas Jesus gives us a new concept of peace through justice. And that's why this justice conversation is one we have to have, Riley.
Yeah, or even just personal peace through surrender or acceptance.
Oh, yeah.
I got into an extended conversation with a couple friends of mine this last week. One initially, and then the other one was sort of explaining the first to another friend. But this idea that we've constructed, or the many ideas that we've constructed about atonement that are based on an obedience model of existence, they create, they negate the opportunity for us to fully realize the potential that's latent within circumstances out of our control that we don't want, but nevertheless they steal you. They make you a better person. I don't have a whole lot of I'm not going to say respect, but I mean, it's not like I look up to people who have had the easy road their whole life. I look up to people who have come through things and come out the other side, much stronger. And I think that's true for everyone, right? And so while we're in the moment, we never like to experience the things that are causing us pain or anguish mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally. We don't like that stuff. But it's always with hindsight, we can look back and say, that made us stronger. That made us better.
Yeah.
That made us more relatable.
Yeah. That reminds me of another Stoic concept, which is many people think that the Stoics are emotionless. And you get this sense that what is meant is they really don't even care one way or the other if even, their children would die in their sleep, because the Stoics in their writings, I think it's Marcus Aurelius who says, when you kiss your child goodnight, say to yourself, they may not wake up in the morning. And it just seems morbid. At times they seem morbid, at times they seem uncaring. And these are really misreadings. They're misunderstandings. The Stoics have a distinction. And sometimes it's all about distinctions. Philosophy is full of distinctions, and distinctions can be really powerful. Again, that distinction between what's in my control and what's not in my control, powerful distinction. The distinction here is between what's preferable and what's not preferable. And so the Stoic would prefer that his child wake up in the morning. He would prefer that his wife wouldn't die. But he's not going to let the fact that something happen, even if it's the death of a child or a spouse, stop him from doing what he does to be a good person. He also doesn't really mind if anybody realizes or admits or acknowledges that he's a good person. That's another concept from Stoicism, right? This idea that again, it's within my control what I do. It's not within my control whether anybody notices that I do it. So I can be a good person and people can say I'm a bad person. I have no control over that. I only have control over who I am. And so people are going to think whatever they're going to think. But I'm going to do my best to do my duty to do what is right. Which again, the Stoic concept of justice, of acting justly toward my fellow man, is a big part of that. Whether or not anyone recognizes it. And if they have a review, as I learned as a professor, rate my professor. Go check it out. Christopher Hurtado, UVU, Salt Lake Community College. There are students who loved me. There are students who hated me. There's very rarely anyone anywhere in between. And that has nothing to do with me, right? Some say you could not approach him and get help. Others say he was so approachable and you could always get help. And you realize I'm the same person. I'm reminded of Eugene England. Eugene England, the LDS philosopher in his own right, even though he was an English professor at BYU. He was teaching at UC Berkeley, and he was teaching Institute across the street from UC Berkeley. And he would cross the street from teaching Institute over to UC Berkeley, and they would say, here comes that conservative Mormon guy. And he would cross the street from UC Berkeley to the Institute building, and they would say, here comes that liberal Berkeley guy. And Eugene England's just in the middle of the road saying, hey, I'm just Eugene England. I just am that I am, and I do what I do.
Do we still feel compelled to explain ourselves, though, right? I mean, because we might do something that we're satisfied with. And let's just break it down to something very basic. We're at home, and there's a bit of a mess, and so we step up and we clean some things. And then another person walks in, our spouse or whoever, and says, this place is a disaster. Maybe you left the dishes out, or maybe you didn't sweep the floor or whatever, or put the clothes away after the laundry was folded. But this place is a disaster, and we still feel compelled to explain ourselves. Well, I mean, I didn't do nothing. I wiped the tables down, and I emptied the dishwasher, and I folded the laundry, and you feel compelled to justify yourself. Is that a positive response to do that? Or is it something we should just leave alone and kind of sit with the moment and let the other person work out their emotions? Maybe the other person just starts cleaning and gets more and more worked up and angry at everyone else who isn't cleaning. And are we okay just to sit there with that? Or should we help the other person along? Should we try to explain ourselves? Like those kind of real world circumstances. What's the good reaction there?
The first thing that occurs to me to say about a situation like that is that, again, the Stoic concept is to recognize that no matter what you have done or haven't done, if you've done what you think is right, that was up to you. Whether someone recognizes it or not isn't, right? There's that. If you try to defend yourself, to answer more directly your question, I think there's an admission somehow that you're a victim. Right? Because if you're not a victim, then why do you have to defend yourself?
Or it's an admission that maybe you didn't do enough.
Sure.
Maybe you're subconsciously
point,
admitting to yourself, "Oh, did I really?" Because I'm not satisfied.
And at that point, Stoic objectivity has to kick in and say, well, this other person raises a valid point. I didn't do that. And then you do it. Or, I feel like I did do my duty. And they don't recognize it. And that's out of my control.
I don't know where to go from here.
Check your notes, Riley. So coming back to the idea of objectivity, right, which is what we're really trying to determine here, what's objective? So somebody's coming at me, with an emotional response, and I could have an emotional response to that too. But what the Stoics are teaching is, no, you let your rational part rule over your emotional side. You let reason rule over emotion. And this is very much a concept that probably comes from Socrates. As I mentioned, Socrates is one of the ingredients that goes into Stoicism. You have Socrates, Heraclitus, and virtue, the idea of virtue. They're different ingredients from ancient philosophy that come together and produce a new philosophy that comes on the scene, like Stoicism. Stoicism, by the way, comes from the Stoa Poikile, which is the painted porch, where Zeno the Stoic met his students, and that's why to this day we call it Stoicism. They were the ones who met by the Stoa Poikile. So this idea of objectivity is, I need to, again, observe what's coming at me and not take it at face value. This is the contemplative part, Riley, right? Because you don't just take things as they come without any kind of filter. You apply reason intentionally as a filter. You say, let me see what's coming at me. Let me evaluate it objectively. What's really going on here? Where is this really coming from? And let me then respond to that rather than respond emotionally to what's an emotional, not necessarily an attack, but something coming at you, right? That's when I say coming at you, it doesn't have to be an attack, right? It's just whatever life throws at you in whatever way it comes at you.
Well, and it seems to me that there's an element here or an ingredient of recognizing that we do live in society. Our life is not fully individual. We can look at a situation and say, oh, I did enough there, but that doesn't actually do anything to ameliorate the tension between two individuals or a group of individuals or more, right? So at a certain point, you have to recognize that I am part of community, and there is a response of some sort that's demanded if we want the situation to improve. And it's just figuring out what that response is that not only is going to explain why it is you feel, satisfied with your effort, for instance, but also to, bring the other person into a better relationship with you in regards to those efforts. And so it might be something along the lines of, I can see that you're disturbed, or I can see that, you're kind of emotional about this. Just so you know, I'm willing to help you. I feel like I did some things and I was satisfied with my effort, but I see that wasn't enough in your opinion. I would be happy to contribute additional efforts. No one talks this way, obviously, in a relationship, but it would just be interesting to figure out how best to respond to situations like that, where, number one, you are satisfied with your effort initially, but recognizing that you're part of a dynamic that's not just completely individual.
Yeah, well, talk is cheap anyway, right, Riley? I mean, what you want to do is act this way. And if you feel like you have to say something, sometimes that's a chance for you to recognize that you're just, you're trying to defend yourself. But you just said that you were satisfied. So you have nothing to defend. But you can, of course, go the extra mile. It's very much a Stoic concept. This brings me back to this Stoic concept of justice and altruism, right? It really is the idea of do unto others as you would have done unto. So you probably did that when you did the cleanup that you did. But this other person has a different concept of cleanup, and you can actually meet that expectation from a place of, I would like to do unto others as they would have done unto them. Sometimes we make that corrective, right? Instead of do unto others as you would have done unto you. I mean, maybe everybody doesn't want me to buy them a book. I keep doing that because that's what I would have done unto me. Maybe I could realize that Riley would prefer a new boat.
Well, and the Christian ideal in this situation is to respond with humility to those desires of those that are around us. When you said go the extra mile, that's pulled directly from, if you're compelled to go a mile, go with him twain, go that extra mile. And so the Christian ideal is, hey, you might be satisfied with your effort, but if someone else is not, well, go with him twain, give him an extra mile. It's a service mindset that goes beyond your level of satisfaction with your own effort. So stoically, from a Stoic perspective, you can say, I'm totally fine with what I just gave there, effort-wise or whatever. And someone else is like, no, I'm not good with that. Okay, I'll give more. And
the Stoicism has something for that too, right? Again, very similar to Christianity, exactly the same as Christianity, really, because altruism is another part of that answer, right? Justice and altruism are the guiding principles in Stoicism to our actions. When we act, we should act out of justice and without going into justice, again, saving that for another episode, there is this idea of, that you've pointed out, of being altruistic, of doing it for the other. To satisfy. I mean, Jesus did this ultimately, Riley. Jesus satisfies our sense of justice with this altruistic self-sacrifice that, can I say, isn't necessary? I mean, for the longest time, I puzzled over this. What is this atonement? What does it do? And I really sat with that question as a philosopher for over a decade and had very few conversations with anyone other than fellow philosophers. Didn't talk to my kids about it or my wife. I talked to Shiloh. I talked to mentors who are my philosophy professors. And ultimately, I came up with an answer that I found out recently is in Hebrews. According to Rob Bell in his sermon on YouTube, the gods aren't angry. It is explained in Hebrews that Jesus does do what he does to satisfy not God, not some cosmic principle, but us, our sense of justice. And that's why, again, we've got to have this conversation about justice.
Well, I think that'll tee us up for the next episode. I'm excited to do that, whether it's justice or some other concept, but we'll get to that soon. So this has been fun. I mean, we've been able to, kind of tease out some Stoic ideas and relate them back to our own Christian discipleship. And it gives us something to think about as we go throughout our lives is, how much control do we really have? And is control really the thing that matters anyway? Is it more about experience? And how can we live a more satisfied, happy even life, despite the circumstances that beset us? And Stoicism has a lot of those answers.
There's a resurgence again in Stoicism today. Ryan Holiday is one of the people at the forefront of it with the books he's writing. He got exposed to Stoicism by asking someone when he was a student journalist, a journalist for a student paper, and was recommended, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. And I think he bought also, so he could, get $25 in free shipping back then, either the Enchiridion of Epictetus or something from Seneca, right? Seneca has essays, letters. The letters from a Stoic, excellent. I usually tell people, if you read the letters from a Stoic, the first letter, and you're not blown away and want to keep reading, then I'll give you your money back for the book. I can't make that kind of offer here in a public forum, but one-on-one, I've told many people that, and I've never had anybody ask for their money back. Never.
Have you, when you read letters from a Stoic, and I've read it, and do you get the same feeling you get when you read, for instance, the letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, that they know posterity's going to read this?
Yeah, sure. These letters purport to be to the person that they're written to,
right.
But they're really meant to be read by the general public. So you have Letters from a Stoic is a famous book by Seneca, collection of actual letters, with the caveat that although they are actual letters, they really are to you as much as they are to whoever is being addressed. You have the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. You have the Enchiridion of Epictetus. And check out Musonius Rufus. Musonius Rufus, his writings have been translated and published only recently into English. I think there's one called that we should disdain hardship or something like that, and another one that's collected sayings and maxims or something. He's one of the aphoristic writers relating back to the Proverbs conversation on our sister podcast.
And the other one I just read was on the shortness of life. That's another Seneca classic.
One of his essays, yeah. Very, very famous essay. What's the punchline in that one, Riley? That life is not short.
Well, time itself is sort of just a construct. It's really about just the experiences of life.
Yeah. Well, we leave you with those reading recommendations and with the concepts that we've shared from Stoicism and from early Christianity, reminding us that these two religions or philosophies, again, depending on whether you're using the ancient or the modern terms, are very much alike, and they have a lot to offer us, and that you can clarify your conception of Stoicism through Christianity, and you can clarify your conception of Christianity through Stoicism. I think you can do that. This is one of the reasons that we explore on this podcast different traditions so that we can get different angles on the same subjects, right?
Yeah, well, just to augment and improve our own spiritual practice and beliefs and the way we interact with our fellow man. So, well, if you've enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to give us a like, give us a share, throw a comment out there, reach out to us individually if you like on Facebook Messenger. You can join our Latter-day Peace Studies Facebook group. We have a page there that shares, some uplifting thoughts. And, of course, I've got my Lectio Divina group if you're into that. We've got all kinds of ways to interact with us, and we encourage you to do that. If you have any ideas to share with us that you'd like to hear about, we are always open to that as well. So, reach out to us. We appreciate interacting with our audience.
Yeah, I very much enjoy hearing from listeners. I do hear from listeners. It's been especially touching, to hear from listeners as I've struggled with my back pain, As I've been absent, I've heard from listeners. I appreciate that. Thank you for listening. And thank you to our volunteers, those who edit the podcast, those who put out the quote images on social media. Thanks to you, Riley, for showing up and podcasting with me. It's been a great conversation.
Well, for Latter-day Contemplation, I'm Riley Risto.
And I'm Christopher Hurtado.
Have a great week, everyone.